It's incredibly hard to find an example fantasy these days without some sort of baseline influence. Races like elves and orcs, and iterations of monsters such as trolls and balrogs are staples in games along the lines of World of Warcraft and nearly all of the Final Fantasy entries. With titles similar to these exhibiting mostly fantasy scenarios and settings, the multitude of inspirations sourced from the beginning of it all, Tolkien's Middle-earth, are blatantly obvious. It's tough to avoid these references to Tolkien's work in some way or another because it has been the definition of fantasy since 1937. You can't exactly blame games under this genre though, as to avoid pulling from some aspect of Tolkien's work would require to completely reinvent fantasy and what it represents. Pulling from Middle-earth is not something that should be a criticism though, as many games provide an original take on the archetypes initially set in place by Tolkien. Enough to make each title under this classification feel unique in that they represent their own story and world. Though while this extremely popular outline has taken center stage when it comes to properties of a fantasy RPG, the space isn't without its rebellious success stories that embrace a different kind of take on the genre. In this video, I'll be taking a look at examples of this genre presented in many of the games we play today, and how they give their takes on the origin of Middle-earth and Tolkien's conception of fantasy. Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth was initially presented to the world a long time ago, so there could be much that is lost in translation when considering originality of a certain piece of entertainment in today's fantasy. I myself at a young age took Final Fantasy as the first iteration of mithril armor, for example. It is such a centerpiece to the beginning stages of almost every entry in the franchise, so a naive player could easily be swung in a false direction concerning just where the origins of this mithril ore came from. Unless my interests and curiosities led me to Lord of the Rings soon after, I would have likely been willing to argue Final Fantasy is the origin of mithril material and equipment. Similar to this resemblance, both the setting of Lord of the Rings Middle-earth and Final Fantasy VII's Midgar are both derived from, well, Midgard. It can be difficult to grasp just how far down the tree games like these are in terms of being inspired by Tolkien's original work. Almost the entirety of the origins to each of the classes or jobs available to customize your party with are derivative of something introduced by the works surrounding Tolkien's fantasy introduction of his Midgard or Middle-earth. The idea of a ranger class, for instance, is sourced from Tolkien's conception of somebody that's one with nature and is in tune with their surroundings. For instance, Butterbur the innkeeper has an aside to say, he is one of the wandering folk, rangers we call them, towards Aragorn. Hence the constant integration of these wilderness elements in the design and mechanics of the class in-game. Sauron is also one of the most heavy influences in terms of the storyline objectives in most of these games. The concept of a Dark Lord being the almighty antagonist to your typical fantasy storyline is mostly because of how he did it first. Creating the plot of seemingly the whole series, hell, he's the Lord of the Rings the books were named after, Sauron is such a great baseline for creators to branch from and imagine their own almighty villain. This isn't to say that one like Golbez from Final Fantasy IV is just a simple copy-paste, but it's hard to deny the similarities in how stories made so long after Lord of the Rings' conception pull from its introduction of a dark antagonist. Even stereotypes that you see in many fantasy entries, such as dwarves preferring to be a fighter and thievery being more of a halfling's job, are given their labels from Tolkien's initial portrayal of the concept of class-to-race pairing. It may not have been the blatant advertisement of classes like we know them now, as Dungeons & Dragons is responsible for creating the class and level system, but the traits you see in these examples throughout RPGs can easily be traced back to a Middle-earth original example. In World of Warcraft as well, stereotypes of modern fantasy are around every corner. Technically, Warcraft pulled more from Warhammer, as you can see the uncanny similarities of races like the orcs and trolls, but at the same time, Warhammer is a work derivative of many elements created in Middle-earth, showing how hard it is to create unique fantasy elements that set themselves apart from the standards set in place by Tolkien. Regardless of the extent of whether or not a piece of fantasy is making a direct reference to Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth, it is bound to be derivative of these elements in some way. The simple idea of partaking in quests consisting of a group of party members is inspired by the adventures gone on by the Fellowship of the Ring. This factor that any piece of fantasy is somehow a product of Tolkien's work could be treated as a slap in the face to developers out there, as it's almost forced a sort of restriction on what they can accomplish in being unique in the space. As a fan of the genre of fantasy RPGs though, I treat it as more of a deep pool of resources that a game can utilize to stand out not as an entirely original concept, but as having flawless execution of beloved qualities. Though I can admit it can be a bit redundant hearing the spiel that I have to collect the powers of the crystals of the four elements and defeat the big bad to save the world for, what is this going to be, the 16th game? It looks sick though, so I'm not complaining. To drill any fantasy game for being unoriginal is to be entirely aimless with criticism. Tolkien nailed creating a foundation for the world of fantasy ahead of him, and it would be criminal to not embrace and take inspiration from his work. Sure, you have seen many games with the familiar feel to the origins of Middle-earth, but just because the source has been taken from over and over again doesn't necessarily make the concept redundant. Because of this inevitability of pulling from Tolkien's work, it gives a vivid impression of the best and how they're allowed to stand atop the mountain after displaying either the most tried and true example of high fantasy displayed in Lord of the Rings, or a new spin on the genre that invigorates innovation for future titles. Whether it's reimagining or honoring Lord of the Rings, there is always room for innovation to give a new take on Tolkien fantasy that will continue to provide for games of the genre for the foreseeable future. As common as another series like Final Fantasy is these days, there are just as many candidates that push against the conceived idea of fantasy. J.R.R. Tolkien introduced the basis of fantasy in a manner known as high fantasy, a subgenre of the overarching term of fantasy, described as being epic in proportions, providing the world and characters with a stature only conceivable in your imagination. While he encompassed traits beyond simple high fantasy, there weren't too many deterrents from the implementation of dragons, elves, and other elements that evolved into what we know today. This avenue taken by Tolkien allowed for its polar opposite to make its mark as a way to rebel against the typical inspirations of Middle-earth and bring things to a realm that feels just a bit more believable. The concept of low fantasy allows for a brand new take on empowering the world we know around us. Culminating over time into one of the most relatable forms of fantasy out there, low fantasy has seeped into many portrayals that stand out as a new and fresh experience to an imaginative world. Stretching from entries like the classic Chrono Trigger to the world of the most played game in the world, League of Legends, most specifically in their delve towards other entertainment with their Netflix series Arcane, low fantasy has been a part of some of the most popular series out there. Allowing the relatability of roaming the city streets, but still maintaining a sense of being a world out of our reach as we live now, almost absorbs the viewer more as they imagine what if something like Hextech existed. Chrono Trigger was one of the first great presentations of a desire to save a world from a monster true to fantasy elements, but without depriving the player of the sense of saving Earth, not a fully imagined world commonly found in high fantasy. Some players may not prefer this take on fantasy when they think of what inspires them to engage with an imagined world, as they prefer to go to a place where there is no resemblance of the world around them, but instead a splurge of everything that they could never begin to fathom in reality. But in the efforts to bring the familiar world around us into the realm of fantasy elements, franchises like Chrono Trigger and League of Legends provide us with characters possessing astounding amounts of intrigue. The inspection into what makes these characters tick goes deeper than your common high fantasy elf. Staples like Luca and Echo in their respective franchises provoke empathy and understanding as their stories are fleshed out. Echo specifically has one of the most resonating stories only possible in this sort of low fantasy setting, where relatability is around every corner. The boy genius is placed between attending the prestigious Piltover University per his parents' wishes, and using his intellect to save the slums he grew up in. Knowing his choice will be devastating to his parents, he utilizes the aforementioned power of Hextech and relives his birthday dinner over and over again, knowing that it's the last time his parents will approve of him. Now that's a very simple summary of the character's story in the world of Runeterra, but the point of delving into Echo's story is to prove that this low fantasy subgenre is capable of an entirely different but equally as effective degree of presenting an imagined world beyond our own. His story feels very real, and I can't say that it would carry the weight that it would if it was placed in a high fantasy setting. Keeping in line with the mood of the world we experience around us allows for themes of relatability to be the blatant message being portrayed. This is still fantasy, it's just not the definition of fantasy as laid out by Tolkien, and, to some, is a more enjoyable way to consume the genre as they can engage with entirely fictitious elements. There are more divergents of Tolkien's style of fantasy out there, but I don't think there are many that capture the realism of a busy, low fantasy, steampunk-esque setting. As explained, there's a sense of Middle-earth in almost every high fantasy experience out there. But this doesn't make titles following the low fantasy style the only example of what it's like to exhibit unique ideas in this space. The presence of a guideline at all when creating a new fantasy world true to its origins makes it so a certain demographic of consumers continue to get more spins of the type of fantasy that they know they will enjoy. Low fantasy and other rebellious subgenres like it seem to have lots of variation in terms of what to expect from setting to setting. Final Fantasy feels very much like Lord of the Rings as they're both a part of high fantasy, while Chrono Trigger and the world of Runeterra are both in the classification of low fantasy, though they execute the idea of empowering the common world very differently. And for both of these halves of fantasy to cover so many bases of what there is to enjoy for content, it's hard to argue that there's another genre that competes with the possibilities and resources of what Tolkien created so long ago. If you enjoyed this video, please check out the rest of my channel and consider leaving a like and subscribing, as it really helps me out. Thank you.